In his lecture material on Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger writes the following, quote, "Metaphysics is the name for the full range of philosophy's proper questions. If these questions are many, they are nonetheless guided by one single question. In truth, drawn as they are into that question, they are in effect but one question. Every question, and especially the one question of philosophy as a question, is always bathed in a light that emanates from the question itself. That is why the very inception of inquiry at the grand commencement of Western philosophy possesses some knowledge of itself. Such autochthonous knowledge of philosophic inquiry initially defines itself by circumscribing and comprehending what it is asking about. Philosophy inquires into the arche. We translate that word as principle, and if we neglect to think and question rigorously and persistently, we think we know what principle means here. Arche and arcane mean to begin. At the same time, they mean to stand at the beginning of all, hence, to rule." End quote. So philosophy inquires into the principle from which we can begin philosophizing. What is the one principle from which knowledge of the world begins? The one principle that rules all. We might recognize this as what is often called the pre-Socratic mode of philosophizing, which Heidegger thinks is the only real way of philosophizing. To the extent that later philosophers can even be said to have philosophized, they had to have engaged in the same thing, inquiring after the arche. So what is the one question that gathers up all the other questions of philosophy into itself? The one question with which we circumscribe and comprehend this inquiry into the arche. Well, further down, Heidegger tells us what this question is, but he says something rather remarkable about how we are to proceed in regards to the question that I would say guides Heidegger's entire way of thinking. Heidegger argues, quote, "The guiding question of Western philosophy is, what is being? To treat this question as stated and posed is simply to look for an answer. To develop the question as it is formulated, however, is to pose the question more essentially. In asking the question, one enters explicitly into those relationships that become visible when one assimilates virtually everything that comes to pass in the very asking of the question. When we treat the guiding question, we are transposed forthwith to search for an answer, and to everything that has to be done on behalf of that search. Developing the guiding question is something essentially different. It is a more original form of inquiry, one which does not crave an answer." End quote. This is the difference between Heidegger and virtually all metaphysicians of the Enlightenment era and beyond, and why he considered the pre-Socratics more worthy of being called philosophers. They were those who had nothing to begin with, no method, no groundwork already laid, no presuppositions established. They had to begin from the beginning because they didn't have the question formulated, let alone an answer. And ostensibly the question is, what is being? But in establishing the inquiry into the one principle this way, we again raise the question of interpreting, well, what is it that we're asking when we ask what is being? Do we even know what we're asking? Moreover, Heidegger reads Nietzsche as being a true philosopher, a man concerned with this fundamental question of what is being. And thus, Heidegger reads Nietzsche as a metaphysician. Heidegger will argue that Nietzsche is misunderstood, first in that he is not generally considered a metaphysician, and that error springs, Heidegger believes, from the general prejudice against metaphysics and just the ignorance of its centrality to true philosophy. So Heidegger says Nietzsche asks this question, what is being? And therefore he's doing a metaphysical investigation. But Heidegger also says Nietzsche is misunderstood as regards his answer. Not because Nietzsche's answer is unclear, but because Nietzsche offers two answers to the question of what is being: the will to power and the eternal recurrence of the same. Both are Nietzsche's answer to the question, what is being? It has seemed to many interpreters as though these two doctrines are contradictory. Will to power is pluralistic, it's dynamic, it's moving. It implies no stasis, only change, a constant struggle of forces, one against the other, against the other, against the other, always ascending or descending, never standing still. And then we have the eternal recurrence. which suggests that all that is forever the same, that all events repeat exactly as they have played out. And one can imagine from a God's eye view that this gives us a kind of static universe. From our point of view within it, everything is moving, but in the final analysis, all moving things, apparently moving things, are eternal. Every time and every place and every event is eternal. Many have indeed suggested that the world as will to power gives us a world as becoming, whereas the world understood through the lens of eternal recurrence gives us a world of being. And that's an apparent paradox in Nietzsche's ideas. But Heidegger argues, quote, "In Nietzsche's philosophy, will to power and eternal recurrence of the same belong together. It is thus, right from the start, a misunderstanding, better an outright mistake of metaphysical proportions, when commentators try to play off will to power against eternal recurrence of the same, and especially when they exclude the latter altogether from metaphysical determinations of being. In truth, the coherence of both must be grasped." End quote. So that's the overall theme, is Heidegger on Nietzsche of this three-part series. But before speaking on Martin Heidegger at any length, as I am about to do, it's more or less required that I give you the disclaimer. It's impossible for me to convey Heidegger's philosophy to you in the span of an hour or so, or even however many hours this lecture series turns out to be. The same as it would be if I took only, 2 hours to explain the whole of Nietzsche. As you know, I've even taken various attempts at doing that over the years, but there's always more complications than you can make known in such a short span of time. And much as I did when we covered Hegel for the channel, my goal here will be to give you some of the broad contours of Heidegger's thought. And I'm going to address my attention to the most important parts of Heidegger's philosophy as regards our analysis here in relation to Nietzsche. And furthermore, whatever I say about Heidegger's philosophy is not really going to compare to the experience of reading Heidegger. I've included a fairly liberal number of Heidegger excerpts, which, as is my habit. Hopefully that'll give you some idea of what reading him is like. But nevertheless, his style can be opaque at times, but it's very rewarding if you're willing to take the time to deconstruct what he's saying. So in any case, it would be really impossible to simply jump into talking about Heidegger's lectures on Nietzsche without first going into how Heidegger thinks philosophically, the basis of his approach to Nietzsche, we'll say. And so today, for the beginning of the episode, we're considering Heidegger's life and background, his project in Being and Time, and by the end of this first part, we're going to introduce his interpretation of Nietzsche. Next episode, we'll get into more into the details of Heidegger's interpretation. So, Martin Heidegger was born in Germany in 1889, which, by the way, is the same year that Nietzsche went insane. The two men share some similarities in their early life. Both were born in a relatively small town. Both were sons of clergymen. Both were expected to follow in their father's footsteps and carry on in the same profession. And both would discover philosophy as teenagers and eventually reject the path of being a priest or a theologian and become philosophers instead. Those are the broad similarities of Heidegger and Nietzsche's early lives. For Nietzsche, it was Schopenhauer's atheistic philosophy and world as will and representation that drew him away. What drew Heidegger away from theology into philosophy was a book about Aristotle by Franz Brentano on the manifold meaning of being according to Aristotle. Unlike Nietzsche, he did not immediately abandon the theological path. He even attended seminary. But Heidegger had frequent health problems that interrupted his studies, in his case a heart condition, but again another strange similarity to Nietzsche, that he has health problems that kind of affect the course of his life and his career. So Heidegger has a health crisis, perhaps even leading to a kind of spiritual crisis, and he changed his studies to philosophy and mathematics. And while at Freiburg University, he studied Edmund Husserl's logical investigations. Husserl is the founder of the philosophical school of thought known as phenomenology, which we will get into in a moment once we discuss Heidegger's philosophy more broadly. In 1916, when Husserl joined the faculty at Freiburg, Heidegger had the privilege of meeting Husserl and working with him as a junior colleague. Heidegger eventually moved to Marburg University, where he focused on his teaching. His philosophical interests were situated with the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, as well as German mainstays like Kant and Leibniz. Heidegger did not publish during this time. It wasn't until 1927 that his most important work, Being and Time, is published. And while it was intended as a mere treatise, laying out the foundations of his philosophical project, the work is massive and still somehow ends up unfinished. It would quickly become one of the most influential philosophical works of all time. Husserl is critically important for the development of Heidegger's thought, but Being and Time also marks an important divergence in Heidegger's understanding of phenomenology, a divergence from Husserl's understanding. It remains an enigmatic tome to this very day, a work that you can spend a lifetime reading and rereading and still continue to discover new things within it, as many scholars have done. Of course, I cannot introduce Heidegger's life as a background to his thought without mentioning a central fact of his life that I'm sure will affect the judgment that you have on him as a person. When Hitler came to power in the 1930s, Heidegger became a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. And as the story goes, when Heidegger stood in line to join the party, as a complete coincidence, he spotted Carl Schmitt, another German philosopher of the period, standing in the same line on the same day. Now, this anecdote points to something about Heidegger's affiliation with the National Socialists that is perhaps a mitigating factor, and the reason why Heidegger and Schmitt would be there joining at the same time. It was in accordance with a new law of the Third Reich that every professor of the German university was required to join the party in order to continue teaching. This fact has often been mentioned by apologists for Heidegger, who will point to the compulsory nature of his having joined the Nazi Party. Nevertheless, we know from Heidegger's notebooks, now called the Black Notebooks, that in spite of his later disavowals of Nazi ideology, he was in fact a supporter of Hitler, even privately. He was elected the rector of Freiburg in 1933 and delivered in his inaugural address an infamous speech, The Self-Assertion of the German University. The speech concerns itself with the role of the scholar and the philosopher under the German Reich. It's not an outright endorsement of Nazi ideology, though some interpreted it that way. Heidegger was trying to walk a fine line, and the fact that he tried to walk that line only ended up hurting him. Eventually, that speech would be banned by the Nazis as incompatible with the party's doctrine. And then after the war, that speech would be used as evidence of Heidegger's Nazi sympathies. So walking that line, he's satisfied no one. And it should be said that even though his rector's address is only debatably sympathetic to the Nazis, Heidegger certainly gave other speeches during this time that were endorsements. Whatever the case may be about Heidegger's own political ideology, it certainly was the public avowal of the party and all of this was certainly compulsory, and Heidegger was certainly willing to negotiate with the Nazis in order to preserve his own career, so judge him however you will. But this was also, in retrospect, again, a bad decision, because Heidegger was eventually forced out of his position as rector a year or so later, and he ceased all political activity. And during his lectures and private comments subsequent to that, he began to make at first small or indirect criticisms of the Nazi regime. Perhaps a certain level of quiet criticism was tolerable, but Heidegger pushed things a bit too far. He eventually fell out of favor with the Nazis, and he came under the suspicion and the watchful eye of the Gestapo. In 1944, toward the end of the war, Heidegger was judged by the party to be the most expendable member of the faculty and sent to dig trenches near the Rhine. After the war, as a philosopher who had expressed Nazi sympathies, he was banned from teaching for 5 years. Heidegger defended his decision to take up the role of rector by suggesting that if it hadn't been him, it might have been someone worse. Perhaps by collaborating with the Nazis, he could stop some brainless party man from turning the university fully into a machine for Nazi propaganda. His argument was something along those lines. And some people were amenable to this. Heidegger's image was gradually rejuvenated in the post-war years. He continued to produce philosophical works and even teach. As a matter of fact, his last lectures were given in the early 1970s on the philosopher Parmenides. Martin Heidegger died in 1976 at the age of 86. He was buried in the churchyard of the small town of Meeskirk, where he was born. The material on Nietzsche comes from his lectures during the war years, during which Heidegger's thought became less systematic. His focus turned from his own search for being to interpretation of other philosophers. Of particular interest to Heidegger during this time were the pre-Socratics, as well as, again, Kant, Hegel, Hölderlin, and Nietzsche. It should be noted that even though this material was written during the time when Heidegger was part of the Nazi Party, it was during the period in which that membership was a mere formality. He was pretty much totally critical of Hitler and his regime by this point, and was sort of persona non grata among the Nazi Party. And as Rick Roderick says in his lecture on Heidegger, the fact that he was a fascist is not in itself a reason to dismiss Heidegger, because quite frankly, that's just the wrong way to think about philosophy. Interesting ideas can come from anywhere. And this isn't to say that his political activity doesn't inform his philosophical thought, right? Even though it seems that's the interesting thing about Heidegger, is his philosophical thought is so disconnected from the real world, even as he's trying to really explain the essence of what it means to be in the real world, but he's so disconnected from any ethical or political or social concern at all, really. I mean, his concerns are purely existential, and I mean that in every sense of the word. So even if you totally reject Heidegger as a human being, he was influential on Sartre, basically every existentialist after him, and the existentialists had a huge impact on literature and pretty much every medium of art in the wake of existentialism. So, and I should say for my part, I agree with Rick Roderick that there's really no one else like Heidegger among philosophical thinkers, so I think he's worth exploring in spite of his politics. And so with that, let's go through, we're going to kind of have a brief consideration and analysis of the ideas of being and time. Now, as we talked about in the beginning, for Heidegger, the original activity of philosophy was the investigation of the question of being. And that's how he characterized the philosophy of the pre-Socratic Greeks. But somewhere along the line, philosophy got sidetracked. We've cordoned off the question of being. That's solely the concern of metaphysics, which was only a sub-branch of philosophy. And even there, within metaphysics, the question of being is located within ontology, a sub-branch of metaphysics. And, so that's what Heidegger's trying to do is he sees the problem with philosophy in general, that it's lost sight of its fundamental task. It's seen that as just one question among others, and many philosophers began to regard the questions of ontology as particularly sort of abstract and rather unmotivating questions, as we began to increasingly turn towards epistemology, theories of knowledge, and increasingly from that towards ethics and how to live in the world. Pragmatism, these things. So philosophy's lost sight of its fundamental task, it's compartmentalized it or willfully ignored it, and Heidegger wishes to change that. The term ontology comes from the Greek. We could say especially of the pre-Socratics, again, that what they inquired after was ta eonta, the things that are. Ontology is the study, therefore, of what it is that actually exists. But even to present ontology that way would be unsatisfactory for Heidegger, to the extent that he thinks the fundamental question is not even to ask about beings, plural. In other words, to ask of the various things that exist, but rather to ask what is being itself. What do we mean when we invoke being itself, the state of existing? What does it mean to say that this thing exists? So in a way, it's a fundamentally different task from that of Thales, who's saying that beings are all water. Thales is trying to name the arche, the one principle, the place at which we begin, where beings come from, where they originate from. but it's a more profound question to inquire as to what being itself is, and we don't really get something really, you might say we get something approximating that with Anaximander and his idea of apeiron. Now, Heidegger says, quote, "Not only is the answer to the question of being lacking, but even the question itself is obscure and without direction," end quote. So being in time is the attempt at such an inquiry that first has to formulate the question. Because as Heidegger says in the quotes we looked at the beginning of the episode, we don't even have the question. We can't begin to look for an answer. We can't rush to an answer. We don't even have the question. Now, as mentioned, Being in Time is unfinished. It was planned as 2 volumes, the second of which is never published. What we hold in our hands when we open the pages of Being in Time is named by Heidegger as the preparatory analytic of Dasein. So it's a preparatory analytic. That's very important. Now, you might ask, what is Dasein? That literally means being here, and it refers specifically to the human existence of being, our experience of being, the experience of being in which we are thrown into a particular place and time and just find ourselves existing. You find yourself being here. That's the experience of human being in the world, Dasein. In some sense, untranslatable. In another sense, Heidegger, he can't even translate what he's trying to say into his native language of German, right? That, in a sense, if you have to spend an entire book analyzing Dasein in order to tell us what it is, and that's in German in the original language, then you could say it's even untranslatable in German, right? So it's kind of it's a misnomer when people say it's untranslatable. What they really mean is that it's a philosophical term, and like most philosophical terms, you need a whole book to really explain what it is. So, the funny thing though is that we all already know what it is. We're already always attuned to the question of being, but it's just that we can't articulate the question. We can't put it into exact words. So, what is the experience of Dasein? Well, we have some sense for it, but can we articulate it? That's the task that Heidegger spends this book attempting. And so what does he say about Dasein? Well, it's temporal. Our being is finite. We're situated in time, and we move through time toward an inevitable point of termination, death. What else about Dasein? Well, we're a type of being that can pose the question of what it means to be, unlike presumably other types of beings. We have a sense for the question. And perhaps that's because of our being toward death, as Heidegger calls it. That's why we care about the answer to this question. That's another thing that characterizes Dasein, is caring. We're a type of being for whom the question of our being is a concern, which, again, presumably would not be the case for other beings like inanimate objects or plants or wild animals. And to the extent that you might say that, such a being might have those qualities, well, if they did, then they too would be Dasein in that case, right? So Dasein is temporal, it is being toward death, and therefore it is caring about being. This does not by any means exhaust what it means to talk about Dasein, but that's at least a starting set of dimensions to consider. So, returning to the human relationship to the question of being, Heidegger says, our being is self-evident to us, but at the same time, what is indicated by our being is far from obvious. Some philosophers have tried to treat the question of being as a kind of a priori claim, something we just know, and gestured towards this fact. That, look, we all know that we exist, even if to say what it means to exist is somehow indefinable, right? Or the definition always escapes us. But Heidegger will say this doesn't obviate the question. This makes an even more pressing demand that we answer the question. Because after all, being is the most universal concept. Anything we speak of, at least presumably, exists. Virtually every sentence I've used in this lecture so far draws on the concept of being. Every time I say a thing is this way or that way, I'm using the language of being, which we all understand. So it is presupposed in philosophy just as it is presupposed in our language. But being, therefore, cannot be represented by reference to any other phenomenon, any individual being, any individual thing with which we are familiar. Being itself is not any one of those things. So when we put to ourselves the question of being, we find we can say nothing concrete about it. The fact that everyone comprehends that he or she is a being, but that no one can say what being itself is, places, as Heidegger says, an enigma before us as part of the human condition. Quote, the fact that we live already in an understanding of being, and that the meaning of being is at the same time shrouded in darkness, proves the fundamental necessity of retrieving the question of the meaning of being. End quote. But again, even as Heidegger says there's this fundamental necessity, as we've said, the book is only a preparatory analytic. So in other words, this voluminous work of over 400 pages in the edition I have is only a preparation for the real work, the real work of ontology. That's yet to be carried out. And Heidegger says that however much an ontologist may write, if his work doesn't clarify the question of being as its fundamental task, then that ontology that he writes will have missed the mark. So it's critically important that we get the guiding question right. But Heidegger spends the whole work getting the question right and not doing the ontology. So take that for what you will. So how does Heidegger prepare us for the investigation? Well, it's by investigating Dasein. In other words, our own relation to being, the type of being that we are. If we could possess an understanding of that, our being in the world, our being in time, that could become an entry point, the beginning of studying being itself. If we can clarify the nature of our own being, we can lay the groundwork for inquiring after being itself. Dasein is ontically what is closest to us. Ontic here meaning referring to the individual existence of beings, referring to the phenomenon as it can be described empirically, concretely. Ontic knowledge is concrete, necessarily. It includes statements about actually existing things. And so Heidegger quotes St. Augustine, quote, "For what is closer to me than myself," end quote. But Dasein is ontologically what is farthest from us. So if you add ology at the end of ontic, what's the root word? Logos. So ontology is a theory of being, the ability to put our knowledge of the ontic constitution of our being into words. Dasein is what we are. It is us. We are it. But we know it only as the ontic constitution of being, so to speak. But we can't speak it, right? We don't have the theory of being. Our ontic experience with our own being cannot give us a theory of being itself. And because all concrete experiences are experiences with beings, we have no concrete experience with being itself. So Heidegger says, no one has yet thought this through to the end. We haven't even begun yet. We have to first prepare with setting out a theory of human being. Heidegger's method is phenomenology. Quote, "The term phenomenology expresses a maxim that can be formulated to the things themselves," end quote. That maxim, or motto, and even the whole idea of phenomenology as a method, Heidegger takes that from his mentor, Edmund Husserl. Heidegger reminds us that the Greek term phenomenon means to reveal, to show itself. So the phenomenon, therefore, is what shows itself. And yet the very terms that we use for phenomena in English, that reveal, those terms reveal, that what shows itself also hides something else. That is to say, that when we say something appears a certain way, that necessarily seems to imply that double meaning, that there's something covered by the appearance, that double meaning is there from the start of the word. It's more so the case when we call something a mere appearance, but just listen to how it sounds if I put the emphasis on appears in a sentence. If I say, it appears that way, or, well, that's how it appears, there's the implication that comes with that emphasis of a semblance or a seeming, but not necessarily actually being a certain way. And this comes through even more strongly in German with the Schein. And Heidegger also points out the etymological connections in Greek, which we won't go into, but he says, quote, "Thus one speaks of appearances of symptoms of illness. What is meant by this are occurrences in the body that show themselves, and in this self-showing as such, indicate something that does not show itself." End quote. And further down, Heidegger continues, quote, "This self-showing phenomenon in the genuine original sense is, on the other hand, appearance, as the emanation of something that makes itself known, but conceals itself in appearance. End quote. So the symptom, the thing that appears, the thing that indicates that there's something there to the doctor in his patient, right? The symptom appears, but the symptom is not the disease itself, quote unquote, whatever that might mean. What is the disease itself? I mean, what platonic form does the disease in itself take, right? Importantly, the disease is not hidden by the symptom. The disease reveals itself in the symptom, but it doesn't show itself as such because it isn't one thing. It's not one object that can be shown. The disease is what is announced by the symptom. And it's a real thing. It's an existent thing that's announced. And yet the way it announces itself, the appearances that make that announcement are obviously not themselves the thing announced, right? We know the world through our senses. So it's the sensations in our own body, which we call symptoms, that we know the disease. So that's the analogy from symptoms to phenomena as understood in phenomenology. So to then fully draw out that analogy, the phenomenon, therefore, is not itself a being. It's the thing that announces being. And that being is both shown and concealed at the same time in the phenomenon. And this is not to say that it has an existence separate from the phenomenon, just as we're not to say that the disease exists separate from the symptoms. So phenomenology, then, we break it down into phenomenon, and again, what's the other part of the word? The logos. What Heidegger emphasizes with phenomenology is that the logos is what lets us see. Yes, logos is the word, but it also has the meaning of making things visible. Quote, spoken communication in what it says makes manifest what it is talking about, and thus makes it accessible to another. Such is the structure of logos. End quote. So phenomenology is the use of reason and discourse, and is the way of seeing what it is that is being talked about. When we look to the things themselves, phenomena, and what is shown in them, and what is concealed by them. That's how Heidegger investigates Dasein, and how he can claim to do so as a way of investigating being. Even the fact that we possess some intuitive notion of being as part of our experience of being reveals something. Quote, the question of the meaning of being is possible at all only if something like an understanding of being is. An understanding of being belongs to the kind of being of that being we call Dasein. End quote. Now, a Nietzschean might well accuse Heidegger of dividing the world in the manner of the Platonists, but Heidegger insists that he's not doing this. Quote, the being of beings can least of all be something, quote, behind which something else stands, something that, quote, does not appear. Essentially, nothing else stands, quote, behind the phenomena of phenomenology. Nevertheless, what is to become a phenomenon can be concealed, and it is precisely because phenomena are initially and for the most part not given that phenomenology is needed. Being covered up is the counter-concept to phenomenon. End quote. So the phenomenon is what reveals, right? It doesn't in itself cover something up. It's that the phenomenon itself is not immediately given. We have to investigate it. Again, to use the metaphor of symptom and disease, the disease itself is not any one of the symptoms, and yet the way the disease is, the way that it has being is in the symptoms. So, and that's our only sensation of it, right? That's the only way it appears. So it's not that the disease does not appear, it's that the appearance announces it without being it, if that makes sense. And that's true of all appearance from Heidegger's perspective. And I think we can take this in a rather straightforward manner, actually. This isn't some Platonic otherworld to Heidegger. Heidegger might say to Nietzsche, bro, it isn't that deep. It just isn't that deep. The appearance is not the thing itself, but the appearance is how the thing manifests for you in your human experience. And so it reveals or announces something that's real. And so obviously it both conceals and reveals, but it's not that we're looking for something behind it. We have to more thoroughly investigate the phenomenon itself. And there's a through line here, I would say, from the thought of Aristotle, who rejects the theory of forms of his teacher, Plato. Rather, he says that the form of the thing, or the idea of it, is not more real than its individual instantiations. And Heidegger once said that his students should prepare for Nietzsche by studying Aristotle for 15 years. Personally, I think that's crazy, but it reveals something interesting about Heidegger that he said that. So Heidegger's inquiry is not, the nature of it is not to say that there's something in itself behind the mere appearance of Dasein. His contention is that we don't know Dasein. We've not conducted a thorough phenomenological analysis of what it means to be in the world. So again, where, it might be easy for a Nietzschean to say that phenomena are the things that are given, they're immediate. A Heideggerian would say no, phenomena are precisely the things that are not immediately given. We have to study them in order to, not just to ontically experience them, but to ontologically know them. And this is the basis of all knowledge, all science, really, isn't it? That phenomena are not immediately given, but have to be studied. That's even true in a practical sense. And so Heidegger says, phenomenology is prior to all science. And I don't mean that in the sense that philosophers claimed epistemology was prior to science and that we have to have a theory of knowledge on which to rest the scientific method, and then we could begin theorizing about the world or something. Rather, our being and the conditions of our being are the basic preconditions of all theories of knowledge even, and in fact all theorizing and all knowledge. So Heidegger's contention is that the phenomenon itself is something that's yet to be known or discovered or made clear. And that's why he calls phenomenology the science of the being of beings, the science of ontology. And so there's something perspectival about this because we can understand Heidegger's project in phenomenological terms as turning our focus to what shows itself in Dasein to see more clearly what is announced. But the Dasein that we always study is our own. It's an ownmost Dasein. It's not Dasein in some abstract sense. And so this is the perspectival element of the science of ontology. Heidegger says, quote, "The being whose analysis our task is always we ourselves. The being of this being is always mine. In the being of this being, it is related to being," end quote. And that last iteration of the term being is capitalized in comparison to the lowercase use elsewhere in the sentence. I mean, that kind of sentence is par for the course. If you're planning on reading Heidegger, by the way, that kind of sentence is what you'll encounter throughout his work. Sometimes it seems as though he's trying to push the number, push the limit of like the number of uses of the word being in a single sentence, like push it to the limit of absurdity. But on the other hand, now that we've gone over the general contours of his work, we can understand these sentences as relatively coherent. The being whose analysis our task is we ourselves. So Dasein, one who finds himself here in the world at a given place, at a point in time, certain background, certain set of circumstances which you didn't choose. Our existence begins with a throw of the dice or by being thrown into existence. And while we can speak of existence in the abstract, the existence we actually experience is Dasein, but it's your Dasein. It's always inescapably ours. It's, again, ontically closest to us. And what is the last thing he says? That in the being of this being, it is related to being with a capital B. We could look at another quote here from Being in Time. Quote, "The essence of Dasein lies in its existence," end quote. So human existence is both inescapably particular, and yet it also announces sign, being with a capital B, being in the sense of what it means to exist. Now, to speak for myself briefly as an anti-metaphysician, I'm predisposed to be allergic to much of the language in Heidegger. But when you understand what he's getting at, I think it becomes clear that his metaphysics, his ontology, there's something admirable about it from that anti-metaphysical standpoint, in that it's an attempt to smash through the centuries of Enlightenment rumination on epistemology, which is really the boring part of metaphysics, right? These endless debates on how we know what we know. And I have presented Nietzsche as a conclusion to that debate in a recent video, as Nietzsche does bring in perspectivism and gets us beyond the sort of Kantian, Schopenhauerian separation of thing in itself from mere appearance. And so there's a way in which Heidegger's project can be seen as, okay, appearances being, fine, let's go to the things themselves then, which are the appearances, the phenomena. Only we discover they have to be studied. They do not instantly give themselves to us. Maybe they do on a sensory level, but as to what they mean, as to what they announce, that's not immediately obvious. It's something that has to be seen with the logos. And so there's a sense in which Heidegger is using the term being to refer to the basic and unquestioned fact of our existence, the experience of our existence. If we go back to the very beginning of the podcast, the first aphorism we ever talked about, how the true world finally became a fable, Nietzsche's aphorism that sort of begins with the Platonic forms and then proceeds through Christianity, the Kantian thing in itself, the true world, as he calls it there, the world of being that transcends the senses. You could see Heidegger as standing at step 6, right, of the true world's been abolished. We have to leap into a new understanding of being now, not as a changeless, enduring substance, nor as a fleeting, phenomenal illusion, right? Not illusory mere appearance either. So to treat phenomenon as being, is that the next step of how the true world finally became a fable? Is Heidegger taking things to the next level? That's one way that you could read him. And the interesting thing is that Heidegger will eventually bring up this aphorism in his interpretation of Nietzsche. And given his opposition to viewing metaphysics from the standpoint of epistemology and theories of knowledge, well, if we could see that entire how the true world finally became a fable aphorism, which Nietzsche calls the history of an error, as the development of that error of epistemology, of separating the perception that we do not have knowledge of the thing in itself, of the objective reality, the objective being of the phenomenon in the mere appearance itself, and thereby separating knowledge from sensation. And in a way, that's what epistemology has done. And Nietzsche attempts to conclude that project to show how that was all along error. And so if we take that seriously, and I would say Heidegger does take that seriously, then he repudiates the entire epistemological project of the Enlightenment, right? That was all ultimately, again, an error, a sidetrack. And I think this largely explains why he goes after Descartes, because he rejects the Cartesian methodology of doubt. The idea that we subject every truth claim to doubt in order to establish its veracity and then thereby establish our own being, even thereby. And Descartes, of course, comes to the conclusion that he does exist as a prerequisite of knowing, and therefore, I think, therefore I am, right? The fact that I do know means that as a prerequisite for that, I must first exist. But Heidegger, we might say, answers, I am. This is the fundamental fact. It's something that we know prior to these theories of knowledge, and know might even be too soft a word for our experience of existence, right? Prior to knowing that we think, we know that we are. That would be another way of putting it. So, and then further, Descartes applies his methodology of doubt to prove the existence of the world, the external world. But Heidegger says, we're already in the world. You had to be situated in the world in order to inquire about the reality or the unreality of the world. Quote, the question of whether there is a world at all and whether its being can be demonstrated makes no sense at all if it is raised by Dasein as being in the world. And who else should ask it? End quote. And then further down, he continues, quote, the scandal of philosophy does not consist in the fact that this proof is still lacking up to now, but in the fact that such proofs are expected and attempted again and again. End quote. To put this straightforwardly, the condition of being in the world, that's the condition Heidegger wants to investigate. He says that that's where our concern begins, is with our being in the world. It's a kind of fundamental fact on that level. And it's not enlightening to ask, but how do we know that? We do know being. We know Dasein. We live Dasein. We are Dasein. So this entire line of inquiry is an error. And I've invoked care and concern quite a lot, but that would be one way of stating Heidegger's fundamental opposition to Descartes in another way, that Heidegger would say, the fundamental constitution of our being is care. It's not thought. It's not knowing. We are such beings that care about the question of being. Heidegger says, primarily because of death, because of our own mortality. But we might say that where Descartes sees himself as a mind, a thinking being, a being that thinks, Heidegger would say we're a being that cares. Care is in fact the prerequisite of thinking, not the other way around. We don't have to think about why it is we should care about something, right? If you don't have to think about why you should care about a given question, you care about the question and then you think about it. Quote, "The being of Dasein is contained in care. The term existence formally indicates that Dasein is an understanding potentiality of being, which is concerned in its being, about its being. I myself am in each instance the being, seiende, existing, seiend, in this way." End quote. So we are a potentiality of being that understands this fact, right? Again, the way that we are a being in time, so a potentiality. And the being of Dasein is contained in care, as he says. So in other words, we could put it, I care, therefore I am. Or I care, therefore I am Dasein. So Heidegger is a kind of reset from the whole Cartesian turn in philosophy. He rejects Descartes' starting point. He rejects his methodology. He rejects Descartes' mind-body dualism, which is not a very remarkable thing. I mean, I would say people have been rejecting Descartes' mind-body dualism from the very beginning, but it's very interesting the way in which Heidegger rejects Descartes' mind-body dualism. Because again, Heidegger starts from his own beginning. He begins at the beginning, so he doesn't really take for granted any of these past philosophical disputations. He's starting from the place where we have to even formulate the questions. So he attempts an entirely original philosophy. Even if some of his points have been made before, he's trying to create an original philosophy, a first philosophy. In that way, he is similar to Descartes. But he would say that the world that, as we experience it, is a world that relates back to ourselves. So we don't see objects, quote unquote, independently of their significance in terms of their relation to others, really, but also to ourselves. So, for example, you don't look at a car coming at you, or, what are some other examples? A pencil you can pick up and write with, or your fiance. You don't say, hey, look, there's an object in the world. Object is an abstracted category. It doesn't really refer to anything. That's like a post hoc operation of the mind, is to group things into objects in that way. That's not how we actually think. Heidegger speaks, for example, of the work world of the handiworker, who sees not objects but tools. The object, as it refers back to him, as a thing he uses, signifying a purpose, a meaning. It indicates, it refers to a whole realm of knowledge or experience. So this objective world is also subjective. It's both. And it also seems clear that as subjects, we're also quote-unquote objects, and that we're embedded in the world in a certain point in time. We're part of that world just like all the other things we experience in it. Heidegger describes, quote, beings which are not completely different from tools and things, but which themselves, in accordance with their kind of being as Dasein, are themselves in the world as being in the world, in which they are at the same time encountered. One would have to say world is also Dasein, end quote. And so this is not, as Heidegger insists, a faith that the external world exists, to return to Descartes' use of the methodology of doubt to prove the external world. That would be just as insufficient of an approach as to prove or disprove that the external world exists, right? Deferring to faith. The problem in all such positions is beginning from a starting place of worldlessness. But, quote, as being in the world, Dasein has already discovered a world, end quote. So, in other words, the two things that Descartes tries to discover, himself and the world, have already been discovered. They've already been, we already have some sort of intuitive understanding of them, even. The task is to disclose what the significance is of our being in the world. But our being and the world, these are not questionable things. And furthermore, they are inevitably or inextricably related, insofar as our being automatically always already discovers a world, and it is only because we are Dasein, we are a kind of being that has an intimation of its being, the question of its being, and cares about that question. It's only from that standpoint that we can investigate the world at all. So the world refers us in that way back to the self, to the subject. But this entanglement of self and world, it creates its own problems. Heidegger says the phenomenological investigation thus far, to the extent that it has even taken place, has mostly turned its gaze to the world rather than raising the question of the being of Dasein. Ontology keeps getting tangled up with the world. The question of being, capital B, keeps getting entangled with the beings, plural. And so Heidegger will say his contention is that our understanding of Dasein has been almost entirely transposed into an understanding of world. Now, what does that mean practically speaking? Well, we understand ourselves through our relation to the world around us. So, for example, by our relation to other people and our role both in broader society and to specific people. Because of this entanglement with the world, when you ask someone who they are, they're likely to list a profession, an occupation, a nationality, a religion, perhaps their role as husband or wife or father or mother. That's what someone will say when you ask them, who are you, right? All these ways of defining oneself places you into a relation with the world around you. And it's there that one says that their self is, where it has being, right? And this is in fact a fundamental way in which we are entangled. We are entangled primarily with others. And Heidegger astutely points out that the word others, it's often, presented as if like, we might think of, I think this comes out of modern critical theory where they'll talk about othering someone and making them separate. But Heidegger says the word others tends to indicate not something totally foreign to yourself, but of a kind with yourself. Even our relationship to tools, like the handiness of objects that refers their meaning back to ourselves that I mentioned earlier. The tool is given meaning not in itself for what it can do in a vacuum, and not even just how it relates to us, but how it relates us to others. Again, what does this mean practically speaking? Well, the handyman does his work when, for example, hired by others to do so. So when, he looks at the world, the work world of his tools and all of these objects around him, they're significant not just because he can build things for himself, but because other people might render payment for that service, something like that. Or we might say, on a more basic level, you pick up a pencil to write words. But what's the significance of the fact that it writes words? Well, the words communicate something to others. If we follow Wittgenstein, there is no private language. There's not even a possibility of a private language. So the words are meaningless unless there are others to communicate something with. And therefore, the pencil is meaningless unless there are others, unless the pencil is seen as a way of communicating with other human beings. Even a weapon that one wields is significant insofar as the weapon is to be used on others, on an enemy. So we're not just among others. Our whole world of objects relates to others, and others are our primary concern. Quote, the world of Dasein is a with world, Mitwelt. Being in is being with, Mitsein, others. The interworldly being in itself of others is Dasein with, mit Dasein, end quote. So included some of the original German terms there. This being with is existentially constitutive of our being in the world. And this is the nature of our entanglement. And there's nothing, quote unquote, wrong with that. I mean, at least not in an ethical sense or something like that. Heidegger doesn't really have much of an ethics. Unlike Nietzsche even, who is an immoralist, meaning in Nietzsche's context, a critic of the conventional understanding of morality, and thus somebody who spends a great deal of time talking about morality, investigating morality, raising questions about morality. Heidegger spends little to no time on this topic. So we can only say the simple fact is, right? It's not a moral fact, but the simple fact is that sign, being, is always covered up by the fact that we end up investigating beings. We end up investigating the world. Ontology always gets entangled with the world. And to the extent that you could take this morally, it's less of a question of right and wrong. It's more of a question of authenticity or inauthenticity. It's more of a question of how you are going to live and how you're going to feel about the way you live. Because again, we have concern over this question of our being, and we have some sort of intimation of that question. But this is precisely why the phenomenon is not the thing given, or why it's not immediately given. Because we understand Dasein, our being here, as being one kind of being in relation to other beings, in relation to a whole world of beings, this with world that entangles our Dasein, or, it becomes a Dasein with. And therefore, when we attempt to make concrete statements about what kind of being we are, those statements end up referring back to the world and not to what is definitive of our being, right? And again, this isn't like wrong in some sort of moral sense, but that might lead to a sense of angst or anxiety as it dawns on us that the fundamental question of being remains obscured to us. This thing that really concerns us, that we really care about, is something that remains undisclosed. So, in what way is Heidegger's investigation of Dasein different? How does it prepare us to discover being? Well, Heidegger discusses as many aspects of Dasein. The most important is the one we've already mentioned, temporality. After all, the work is entitled Sein und Zeit, Being and Time. Quote, "Time must be brought to light and genuinely grasped as the horizon of every understanding and interpretation about being." End quote. As mentioned, time is our potentiality. Temporality is where we find the possibility of there even being possibilities. What each of us has as Dasein is a future. That's the main resource, is time that we possess. And so that's a necessarily finite resource, the first thing we might notice about it. It's where we locate all of our so-called potential, is in the future. The present for us, for Dasein, is given its significance by the future. Presumably, everything we're doing in the present is for the sake of the future. The future is where all the value in our lives can be found, if I were to put it into Nietzsche's terms, the terms of valuing. And so Heidegger says, quote, "Dasein exists as a being that in its being is concerned about that being itself, essentially ahead of itself. It has projected itself upon potentiality of being. In its project, it is revealed as something thrown. It constantly expresses itself in addressing and talking over what is taken care of. The circumspect taking care of common sense is grounded in temporality, in the mode of making present that awaits and retains. As taking care and calculating, planning, preparing ahead, and preventing, it always already says, whether audible or not, then that will happen. Before, that will get settled. Now, that will be made up for. That which, on that former occasion, failed or eluded us." End quote. So every meaningful statement, we could even say every movement of thought or action, all of it is situated in time, not just in space, obviously. But importantly, the temporality of everything is addressed in this passage, but also the potentiality of being, which is in the future, and that's why Dasein is essentially ahead of itself. That's the future into which it projects itself. We're always projecting into the future, taking care for the future, throwing ourselves into the potentiality of being, which is necessarily what we find in the future. So we orient ourselves, we situate ourselves in temporality. That's how we understand all of our taking care. We're taking care for the future, or making up for something in the past, or, all the variations on that. And as mentioned, the future is not only where all the potentiality is, it's also where all the potentiality is closed off. It's sealed off at death by the certainty of death, which closes all possibilities. So that is also what it means to be human, to be a being toward death, a being that cares about its being and knows that its being has a expiration date, knows that all of your potentials live, so to speak, in the future, a future which is nevertheless determinate and limited, even if it's not consciously determinate. And we can experience the deaths of others as external events, as historical events, empirical events, as facts, right? But we don't experience our own death that way, right? We won't experience our own death as a historical event, as a fact in the world, because when it becomes a fact, we no longer are in the world. And so death itself is not an experience that informs Dasein, but the knowledge of death is. And there are numerous ways of dealing with this. I mean, many hide from the reality of being toward death. We acknowledge that death is certain, and yet we add a but to the end of the statement, but not right away, right? Whether spoken or not. Heidegger points out, however, that this not right away ignores the indefiniteness of death's when. Quote, "Every day being toward death evades this indefiniteness by making it something definite. But this procedure cannot mean calculating when the demise is due to arrive. Dasein rather flees from such definiteness." End quote. So, of course, we cannot know for certain when our end is to come. Even if you're scheduled for execution, you don't know that it's actually going to be carried out. What if something extraordinary or miraculous happens where it doesn't get carried out? You never really fully know. And it can obviously come much, much sooner than you imagine. And so this is a way in which Heidegger is actually like many other philosophers. In some ways, he resembles Kierkegaard or maybe Montaigne or Pascal, sort of bringing the certainty of death at any moment to the forefront. And he ultimately says, quote, "The full existential and ontological concept of death can now be defined as follows. As the end of Dasein, death is the own most non-relational, certain, and as such indefinite and insuperable possibility of Dasein. At the end of Dasein, death is in the being, sign, of this being, signed in, towards its death." End quote. So death is the ultimate possibility, because it's the possibility that ends all possibilities. And yet, it's non-relational. It can never be experienced as an objective presence in the world. It can only be something that happens to others. It can't be defined as something belonging to us in what Heidegger calls an undifferentiated way, as something individual. It is our own most possession. Your own death is yours. It's not experienced in the deaths of others, even if the deaths of others point you to the certainty of your own death. And death is in the being, of Dasein, as its end. We cannot calculate when it will come, and yet it is the inevitable possibility, the possibility that closes possibilities. In this way, it's definitive of the type of being such as we are. And that relates us back again to Heidegger's concern with authenticity. We can be toward death authentically or inauthentically. That's the language Heidegger finds instead of morality, as mentioned. Quote, "Authentic being toward death cannot evade its own most non-relational possibility or cover it over in this flight and reinterpret it for the common sense of the they. The existential project of an authentic being toward death must thus set forth the factors of such a being, sign, which are constitutive for it as an understanding of death, in the sense of being toward this possibility without fleeing it or covering it over." End quote. And if we are attuned in such a way as to keep to mind this constant existential threat to our own existence, this will produce a state of being known as anxiety, which Heidegger distinguishes from ordinary run-of-the-mill anxiety, even distinguishes it from anxiety as an emotion. Here he means anxiety as the disclosure of the most extreme possibility, the closing of all possibilities, which nevertheless has the potential to push us to an authentic being toward death, and thus an authentic being in the world. We might say that our normal, everyday anxieties stem from the way in which we are involved with the they, as Heidegger puts it, the relations to others that comprise our being in the world. But anxiety makes it possible to turn from this relational orientation to one that's totally individual, which totally takes ownership of the individual and ultimate possibility of our existence, which is its end. And Heidegger puts this beautifully, quote, "Anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they-self and brings it face to face with the possibility to be itself, primarily unsupported by concern that takes care, but to be itself in passionate, anxious freedom toward death, which is free of the illusions of the they, factical, and certain of itself." End quote. And the concern with authenticity invites the comparison to Heidegger's French counterpart Sartre, who is similarly concerned with the individual living an authentic life in full understanding of the human condition. And this is why Heidegger is such a central figure in the creation of existentialism. Existentialism really formally begins with Heidegger, even though, as I've mentioned on the channel, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are usually considered the forerunners. But Heidegger creates existentialism by doing what? Investigating existence itself directly as a phenomenon, with the eye to determining the essence of existence through the ontic experience of the phenomenon. So, the ontological truth revealed by our ontic constitution. And what does he derive from this? Well, a philosophy of authenticity and freedom. And so even as he proceeds through this labyrinthine structure of arguments, we begin to see many of the familiar traits of the existential tradition emerge in Being and Time. And there's therefore a potential contrast with Nietzsche insofar as his greatest idea, the one that Nietzsche says he has 6,000 feet above man and time, is the eternal recurrence of the same events. And it's an idea that also has significance as an ownmost fact, as Heidegger would have put it. The significance of the eternal return is not the eternal return of other people, of other lives, of every last detail in someone else's life. That's not what we care about. That's not what we're concerned with. That's not what we might become anxious about. Nietzsche's concern is raising this possibility of the eternal recurrence of the same within your own life. As the demon says in The Gay Science, imagine that everything you have experienced, everything, the spider in this moonlight, and I myself will come back to you in the same sequence, in the same fashion, every detail exactly the same. That makes our existence an eternal existence, an eternally repeating tune with no variation. Now, the way I interpret Nietzsche, accepting his eternal return of the same is a very different truth with a very different effect than accepting the truth of one's own being toward death. The eternal return and the being toward death are both methods of spurring you on to authenticity, and yet they're opposites in a very important sense. We have, on the one hand, absolute infinitude of one's own life versus absolute finitude. And I'll leave you to work out whether Heidegger's method for leading us to authenticity or Nietzsche's is the better route or the more reliable route, however we want to put it, which one's actually more authentic. It's a bit of a hard argument to say that Nietzsche's eternal return provides the kind of certainty that Heidegger's being toward death is. And yet, one can easily see how the hypothetical eternality of every life decision could lead you to take each decision very authentically. And meanwhile, we can also see how easy it is in the world as Heidegger describes it to live inauthentically toward death. I mean, he says most people do live inauthentically toward death. And maybe that's because they haven't fully uncovered the phenomenon of Dasein yet. But many people manage that. So it's an open question, but arguably both are aimed at the same thing, just by opposite means. And, by the way, Heidegger does lecture on Nietzsche's eternal recurrence of the same. And I think he takes a very similar interpretation as I would. I think he would append to my interpretation that the eternal return of the same also means the eternality of your being toward death. I don't think he fully tries to synthesize Nietzsche's philosophy with his own, but I think Heidegger might say that there is a way in which eternal return could be commensurate with the being towards death. That, in some sense, the finitude of your life is precisely what's being eternalized. That might be one way of putting it. And I think this takes us maybe too far into the weeds to go too deeply into this, but I would simply say, I think Nietzsche really saw the significance of the eternal return of completely exploding the idea that your life is finite. I think he would say that if the eternal return is true, if you truly accept that, then your life is in fact not finite. In other words, I am aware that Heidegger could try and have it both ways, but I think Nietzsche himself would resist that. He wouldn't want to mediate the two ideas. He would see it as very important that there is no finitude at the end of one's life, that it is an eternally repeating tune, that is the aspect that we should focus on, is the eternality, not the finitude, even if the eternality even includes the finitude or something like that. But I don't think we need to go further into the weeds on that. That's all Heidegger and Nietzsche on the eternal return as it relates to this question of authenticity. What we're going to focus on for the rest of the episode does involve the eternal return, but more as it relates to will to power, the interrelation of Nietzsche's concepts, where I do think that Nietzsche I think that Heidegger's interpretation is quite faithful or quite commensurate with Nietzsche's own vision. So Heidegger's material on Nietzsche comes from his lectures between 1936 and 1940. That's what we're going to look at for the rest of this episode. Heidegger, at the beginning of this first volume of material, entitled The Will to Power as Art, firmly establishes his belief that Nietzsche is in fact a metaphysical philosopher. Quote, "As the name for the basic character of all beings, the expression will to power provides an answer to the question, what is being? Since antiquity, that question has been the question of philosophy. The name will to power must therefore come to stand in the title of the chief philosophical work of a thinker who says that all being ultimately is will to power. If for Nietzsche, the work of that title is to be the philosophical main structure, for which Zarathustra is but the vestibule, The implication is that Nietzsche's thinking proceeds within the vast orbit of the ancient guiding question of philosophy, what is being? Is Nietzsche, then, not at all so modern as the hubbub that has surrounded him makes it seem? Is Nietzsche not nearly so subversive as he himself was wont to pose? Dispelling such fears is not really necessary. We need not bother to do that. On the contrary, the reference to the fact that Nietzsche moves in the orbit of the question of Western philosophy only serves to make clear that Nietzsche knew what philosophy is. Such knowledge is rare." End quote. So we return at the beginning of these lectures. Being is the guiding question of philosophy. It's an ontological question, which is to say a metaphysical question. That's how Heidegger interprets Nietzsche's will to power, as an attempt to answer that question. In other words, will to power is a metaphysical theory. Will to power is, in fact, not a description of the way of being, of any particular kind of being. It's a description of being itself. And even if we Nietzscheans might say that Nietzsche himself opposed the framing of being as a way of approaching the world, he opposed that entire mindset. I mean, we might think of his statement in Twilight of Idols that for whatever he might have been wrong about, Heraclitus will remain eternally right, that being is an empty fiction. Well, perhaps Heidegger would pull a Nietzschean fast one on us and say that perhaps we're just being tricked by language here. That Nietzsche's not saying that we ought not investigate the nature of existence, of things, how they really are. Nietzsche's real target is, in Heidegger's reading, Platonic being, the old enemy of Platonism. Nietzsche frames himself as an anti-Plato. He attacks Plato's idea of being as static, is therefore unreflective of the moving reality of nature. In other words, that Plato's version of being doesn't tell us about things as they are, it tells us about things as they are not. Plato doesn't tell us anything about the real world. He's not phenomenological. He doesn't go to the things themselves. For Plato, being is located behind the phenomenal world. And Heidegger will contend that's the being that Nietzsche attacks, not phenomenology. And so, again, even though I must admit I'm allergic to Heidegger's language here, that opposition to Platonic metaphysics is at least the way I presented Nietzsche's anti-metaphysics in the very first episode, drawing on that aphorism, how the true world finally became a fable. So my steel man for Heidegger here is that you shouldn't just tune out and say, well, he clearly hasn't understood Nietzsche at all. What I would suggest is that in Heidegger's phenomenological method, he is actually not trying to superimpose an other world. He is trying to go to the things themselves, the beings, and see them more clearly, including our own being, Dasein. And he sees Nietzsche's project as being equivalent to this. The will to power is metaphysics in the sense that it's an attempt to make a statement about the real world, not about what's behind the real world, and not about a world, an intelligible world that doesn't resemble this one, but rather to make a statement that's definitive of what it means to be in the world. And for Nietzsche, what it means to be in the world is will to power. All life is will to power. The whole world is will to power and nothing besides. And we've wrestled with that idea of whether this is a metaphysical idea or not. And I would ultimately say within my language and the way I talk about philosophy, it ultimately is not. But in Heidegger's language, it is. And I hope I've made it clear what the way that Heidegger thinks about this, and that it may not be quite as problematic as a Nietzschean might ascribe to Heidegger's view. Now, Heidegger spends a great deal of time arguing at the beginning of this lecture series for the importance of the book, Will to Power. Here referring to the planned magnum opus of Nietzsche's, not to the concept itself, arguing for will to power, the text. And Heidegger, he recites letters in which Nietzsche mentions the project as the main structure of his work. Again, as he mentions, Zarathustra is only the poetic vestibule. The reason why this is such a big issue for Heidegger is, like, we all know the controversy around will to power. We all know that the notes that make up that volume were unpublished. It was a planned magnum opus, but Heidegger bases the main thrust of his argument on the fact that it should be taken as Nietzsche's magnum opus, that this unfinished project is the most important thing in Nietzsche, and not Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So it's of great interest to Heidegger to argue that the book Will to Power is not a historical forgery, that it's not a project that Nietzsche lost faith in and then abandoned. Should be considered one of the books in Nietzsche's canon and the most important one. And, Will to Power is like the central work for Heidegger. For our purposes, I'm not going to spend any time on these arguments. I use Nietzsche's unpublished material rather freely. It's not really an important consideration to me whether he planned Will to Power as the most important work or not. I kind of weight all of Nietzsche's words equally, because to me what's important is that Nietzsche had the thought and he wrote it down, right? It doesn't really matter how important he says, this thought is my central thought, this is the most important thing. I mean, I guess it does kind of matter. But nevertheless, in terms of like for interpreting and cross-referencing Nietzsche's ideas with one another, I pull from all over the place in his work. It's not that big of an issue for me. We'll grant for the sake of argument, for the sake of Heidegger's argument, that Nietzsche's The Will to Power, that book contains valuable insights, that we could find the center of Nietzsche's philosophy there. I don't think we need to adopt that that's actually the case, that this is the central work, that this is the most important magnum opus, in order to say, perhaps the key to unlocking Nietzsche's philosophy is there in all of these notes. My main problems with Heidegger's argument is just simply that, Nietzsche, when he went back to his earlier works from the middle period, he added all these prefaces to them to tell the reader, these aren't my finished philosophy, it's just an incomplete form of my philosophy. This is my convalescence from Wagner. That tells me that Nietzsche could have easily changed his mind again. Like if he'd been given another 5 years of sanity, he might have completely restructured the planned opus Will to Power. He might have even published it and then distanced himself from it later. We don't know, He might have had some new level of understanding beyond that. Nietzsche's thought was always evolving. I mean, the works from 1888 are very different from the works from even a couple years before. So that's why these claims are always kind of uninteresting to me, because it can only ever be speculation. But at least at one time, he had this idea for the grand work, The Will to Power, subtitled The Revaluation of All Values. And Will to Power was indeed the central concept in that work. And it is in those notes that we find the most metaphysical version of Nietzsche, at least in the Heideggerian sense of the word. He's most focused on Will to Power here, and on the eternal recurrence for that matter, and of course on the revaluation of values that he intends. So, in other words, Heidegger feels he has to defend the position that Will to Power should be taken, the book should be taken as authoritative. It's the most significant source for comprehending the whole of Nietzsche's philosophy. I don't feel it's important, but we know at least at one time he thought that this would be his central philosophical work. And I do want to say before we move on, though, it is funny to me that Heidegger, right? So Heidegger's known for a great magnum opus, which is nevertheless unfinished, Being and Time. So it's funny that he would find the most significant work of Nietzsche to be Nietzsche's own unfinished magnum opus. And so does Heidegger just have a fetish for these unfinished great works, right? And I think that's, for Heidegger, the inquiry after the question of being is perpetually unfinished. I think this whole project in Being and Time, again, it's a preparation to do the actual inquiry, a formulation of the question. And he often makes these kind of, disparaging remarks about the people who rush to the answer. So Nietzsche's great work, The Will to Power, it's the same kind of work as Heidegger's Being and Time. So I think it's no coincidence that he sees this work as most important. And I think that reveals something about the tendencies of Heidegger. And I think it's actually what makes Heidegger so valuable and so profound. He never aims to complete a system or makes the pretense of having resolved the difficulties of philosophy. He really enjoys the difficulties of philosophy. I think the act of thinking, he sees value in that. He doesn't approach thinking with the intention that he could produce a finished product, solve the human condition. In other words, put an end to thinking. That's so often what it seems like philosophers are trying to do, strangely enough. And it's another potential comparison to Kierkegaard and Kierkegaard's wrestling with faith. Heidegger wrestles with philosophy in the same way. Heidegger, like Kierkegaard, wants to make something harder for us rather than easier. Our drive to understand our very being is something that has to be confronted anew by each person. The solutions reached by others, by the they, cannot unriddle existence for you. You have to exist in this perpetual concern over your existence. No one else can hand you a solution for it. It's an open question whether the possibility of a solution in the conventional sense of that word really exists, whether that's really what lies at the quote-unquote end of one's inquiry. And we have to ask, is there an end to one's philosophical inquiry other than the closing off of all horizons that is represented by death? Do we not have to struggle with being every single day, every day that we think? And if that struggle were to end, philosophy too would end. And so on a personal level, I think this is the best aspect of Heidegger, that in what he offers as an exemplar of the philosopher who begins at the beginning and does not rush to the ending. He sees every thinker as having to begin for himself anew, chase down the question for himself. Now, we're only going to really explore one core concept of Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche today, and it's perhaps Heidegger's strongest point in interpreting Nietzsche. And Heidegger will argue, in fact, the will to power, the eternal recurrence, and the revaluation of values. They're all of a kind with each other. The central themes cohere with one another. In fact, they require one another. This is why it's very helpful to know the basic concepts in being and time, because the distinction that Heidegger makes in describing the will to power and the eternal recurrence and the way that they relate to each other invokes that distinction that he's already drawn in that book. In Being and Time, Heidegger makes it very clear that in inquiring about being itself, we're not talking about the being of beings. As Dr. Michael Sugrue puts it in his reading of Heidegger, if being is the light that allows us to see, illuminating the various things, the light itself is not a thing illumined. It's a fine metaphor given that logos is that which helps us see, and phenomena are those things that appear while still concealing something. But it's not an adequate metaphor insofar as all metaphors for being fundamentally fail, because we can't describe it in concrete terms because it's not any particular thing. Nevertheless, this distinction between inquiring about beings and inquiring about being is important here. Heidegger writes in Part 4 entitled The Unity of Will to Power, Eternal Recurrence and Revaluation, and I'm quoting here in an abridged form, quote, "The expression will to power designates the basic character of beings. Any being which is, insofar as it is will to power. The expression stipulates the character that beings have as beings. But that is not at all an answer to the first question of philosophy, its proper question. Rather, it answers only the final preliminary question. For anyone who at the end of Western philosophy can and must still question philosophically, the decisive question is no longer merely what basic character do beings manifest, or how may the being of beings be characterized, but what is this being itself? The decisive question of the meaning of being, not merely the being of beings. What is will to power itself, and how is it? Answer, the eternal recurrence of the same. The fundamental character of beings is will to power, willing, and thus becoming. Nevertheless, Nietzsche does not cling to such a position, although that is usually what we are thinking when we associate him with Heraclitus. Much to the contrary, in a passage purposely and expressly formulated to provide an encompassing overview, Will to Power 617, Nietzsche says the following, quote, "Recapitulation, to stamp becoming with the character of being, that is the supreme will to power," end quote. This suggests that becoming only is if it is grounded in being as being. Quote, that everything recurs is the closest approximation of a world of becoming to one of being, peak of the meditation, end quote. With his doctrine of eternal return, Nietzsche in his way thinks nothing else than the thought that pervades the whole of Western philosophy, a thought that remains concealed but is its genuine driving force. Nietzsche thinks the thought in such a way that in his metaphysics he reverts to the beginnings of Western philosophy, end quote. So again, those pre-Socratics, the beginnings of Western philosophy are found with Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and others. The natural philosophers who wish to name the arche, to name the one principle. And initially, you can see how they approach this as, is it one thing? Well, that would be to treat being as a thing, as a being. Rather, as Heidegger says, it's more like a beginning place. It's the first principle from which we can say everything is, but it's not itself a thing. Now, the funny thing about this move is that you can interpret Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche here as making becoming the arche. He says Nietzsche's task, citing a note that Heidegger will cite again and again, is to stamp becoming with being. You could also say, though, that this move of making becoming the arche makes being a becoming. It works in reverse, too. It makes being decisively not a thing, not a stasis, not a unity, not something behind the world. How does eternal return do this? By making will to power, which is multiple, moving, pluralistic, into the one principle. The arche, in other words. So grounding becoming as being through the assertion that all moves, all transforms, all changes, every moment of flux, all of that is nevertheless eternal. So we simultaneously perceive existence as change and eternality at the same time. That note of Nietzsche's entitled Recapitulation, Heidegger sees as of central importance, because Nietzsche explicitly states in this note that this thought of becoming as being is the highest form of will to power, which is very interesting. It provides Heidegger with a useful riposte against those who would say that Nietzsche is an irrationalist. He devotes some time to this at the beginning of the material, which I kind of glossed over, but he references Nietzsche's comments on thinking as a kind of feast, not as something worthless or extraneous, but the highest activity of will to power. And the feast, of course, is what Nietzsche calls an expression, of paganism. So the feast of thought is the philosophy, right? And given that Nietzsche is such a critic of philosophers, particularly of the theoretical way of philosophizing that comes into being with Socrates and Plato, again, this kind of cuts against the grain of how Nietzsche is usually interpreted. And to square that circle, I think we only have to once again return to Heidegger's conception of philosophy as this inquiry about the arche, rather than a source of ethics or a guide to social planning, or whatever the case may be. Those are areas in which philosophy is being misused, or in which the drive to knowledge, as science rather than philosophy, has run astray of its guiding question. And so Socrates and Plato take philosophy from its grounding into the clouds of theory. Now, I've quoted from that note before, Recapitulation, when we did the 2-part episode on the eternal return way back in season 2 of the podcast. And I interpret the note in much the same way that Heidegger does. I was pleased to recognize that as I delved deeper and deeper into Heidegger's work, that I agree with him on many points. But as we move forward, because Heidegger does constantly cite that note, it will be very helpful to familiarize ourselves with the whole thing, or at least refamiliarize ourselves with it. So I'm going to read it in full, and then I'll kind of go through with a brief analysis and bring in a little bit of kind of how Heidegger interprets it, how not only my analysis of the note itself, but also just its importance to Heidegger. So this is Will to Power 617. Quote, "To stamp becoming with the character of being, that is the supreme will to power. Twofold falsification, one by the senses, the other by the mind, in order to preserve a world of being, of perdurance, of equivalence, etc. That everything recurs is the closest approximation of a world of becoming to one of being, peak of the meditation. The condemnation of and dissatisfaction with whatever becomes derives from values that are attributable to being. After such a world of being had first been invented, the metamorphoses of being, body, God, ideas, laws of nature, formulas, etc. Being as semblance, inversion of values, semblance was that which conferred value. Knowledge itself impossible within becoming. How then is knowledge possible? As error, concerning itself, as will to power, as will to deception. Becoming as invention, volition, self-denial, the overcoming of oneself, not a subject but a doing, establishing. Creative, not causes and effects. Art as the will to overcome becoming, as eternalization, but short-sighted depending on perspective, repeating on a small scale as it were the tendency of the whole. What all life exhibits, to be observed as a reduced formula for the universal tendency, hence a new grip on the concept life as will to power. Instead of cause and effect, the mutual struggle of things that become, often with the absorption of the opponent, the number of things in becoming not constant. Inefficacy of the old ideals for interpreting the whole of occurrence, once one has recognized their animal origins and utility, all of them furthermore contradicting life. Inefficacy of the mechanistic theory gives the impression of meaninglessness. The entire idealism of humanity hitherto is about to turn into nihilism, into belief in absolute worthlessness, that is to say, senselessness. Annihilation of ideals, the new desert, the new arts, by means of which we can endure it, we amphibians. presupposition, bravery, patience, no turning back, no hurrying forward. In B, Zarathustra, always parodying prior values on the basis of his own abundance. End quote. All right, so first of all, there's been a twofold falsification, one by the senses, the other by the mind, in order to preserve a world of being, which Nietzsche here ties to persistence or equivalence. So, again, being in that Platonic sense, which is the way things actually, the way phenomena aren't actually that way, right? Something behind the world, something which persists, and something in which there is equivalence. So the power of the word concept to falsify by equating the unequal, a concept we've discussed in great detail on the podcast. And this points to a perhaps like an inherently Platonic nature of the word concept that we can't seem to get away from. The word concept becomes like a form that groups together under it, so to speak, phenomena which are in truth absolutely individual. So we see this category, this form, as enduring, as persistent, beyond the changes of becoming, beyond all those innumerable small differences between individual things. And even the senses lie to us about this, because our senses also group things together in this way. Just to use the example I've used before, you could hypothetically see a phenomenon as one thing or trillions of particles, but we see the one thing. We see the tree or the pencil or the automobile, whatever the case might be. And that's very helpful to think of in the terms that Heidegger presented it, right? That we see these objects insofar as they relate back to ourselves. And further, we even make these kind of Platonic groupings on the sensory level, in that we don't perceive one tree or one type of animal as being, we don't perceive them all on an absolutely individual, peculiar level. We see them all as members of a class. And this idea metamorphosizes into, quote, body, God, ideas, laws of nature, formulas, etc. Again, we've gone over this before, very recently in the Gay Science read-through, but Plato's form of the good, the highest form, the form of forms, this becomes reified into the Christian God. And even secular people who don't believe in God often still believe in laws of nature. They believe in these mathematical equations and formulae, which Nietzsche calls in the Gay Science shadows of God. So now if we go to the end of the passage, to jump ahead to the end, Nietzsche says this mechanization of the world is leading to a world of meaninglessness. So you can see the through line to where that Platonic vision of the world eventually leads to that, the world which is purely governed by these shadows of God that have darkened our minds. There's no actual God, this creative force, this source of all valuing and all life, even if that was a false story, a mendacious story, something imagined, something pushed off into an overworld. Well, when that value devalues itself and we no longer believe in that anymore, then it's only the shadows of God that remain. And that's sort of what the mechanization of the world is driving towards, is this purely Platonized, theoretical world, this world that's mediated through intelligible abstractions, but which no longer motivate us in the same way that Plato's form of the good did, or indeed that God did. So why then would we want to stamp becoming with the character of being? Well, on the one hand, as we've said, we're rescuing being from the Platonic conception. On the other hand, Nietzsche says something very interesting in this note, quote, knowledge itself impossible within becoming. How then is knowledge possible? As error concerning itself, as will to power, as will to deception, end quote. So this is the artistic nature of the will to power, which is philosophy. In other words, the question, what is being? Well, if knowledge itself is impossible within becoming, then knowledge has to become being. How is this possible? Well, as an act of will to power. But what is the operation of that? Well, notice Nietzsche uses the term eternalizing. And this is a sort of error. It's sort of a deception. Nietzsche directly ties this to error and deception. Knowledge becomes possible through the will to power's deception of eternalization. So how does this all work? I mean, Nietzsche says becoming is, quote, invention, volition, self-denial, the overcoming of oneself. Not a subject, but a doing. So as life says in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I am that which overcomes itself. Every thing within becoming, every being, to use Heidegger's terms, is always inventing itself anew. That's, in effect, what you could say its will is, what its willing is, its own attempt to deny itself in order to create itself, establish itself anew. Because becoming is always moving, always developing, always changing. So each being determines itself anew, wills itself anew. That's what it means for beings to exist. Every being does this. And Nietzsche tells us in Beyond Good and Evil, all life is fundamentally the drives. Every drive reinvents the world, according to its own ruling thought, as he puts it. And that's the way in which there's this relation between thinking and willing. Thinking is willing, willing is thinking. Every drive calculates in its way. A drive, quote unquote, thinks about the world, largely in a manner unconscious to the rational subject. But every bit of conscious thinking, even abstract philosophical thinking, is in itself reflective of or a reification of one of these drives. And so we return to that curious sentence, quote, art as the will to overcome becoming as eternalization, but short-sighted depending on perspective, end quote. And so when Nietzsche says that's repeating on the small scale the tendency of the whole thing, all life is becoming, which is to say will to power, which is to say beings overcoming themselves, changing. So that would be the being of beings in Heideggerian terms. And then each individual being replicates the process on its own scale. So from its perspective, it overcomes itself. It reinvents the world to reflect its drive, its will. And it's short-sighted because no individual phenomenon encompasses the whole thing. It sees only part of the whole from its vantage point. It sees its own horizons of becoming, we might say. And to say a word about Nietzsche's perspectivism in relation to Heidegger, I mean, again, this is thrownness. This is Heidegger's proposition as well, that particularly as regards Dasein, we're thrown into the world. We don't begin from a neutral starting place. There's no disinterested, dispassionate set of first principles. We're not rootless. We're not the viewer from nowhere. We spring up into being in a given place and time, and we have a certain set of experiences, and we have a certain nature and nurture that all shapes who we are. And none of us experience, therefore, becoming as such, for whatever that might mean to experience that. Rather, we experience becoming as a being in the world. We experience the particular self overcoming, the change that characterizes our own existence. So we experience an ownmost becoming in the same way that Dasein is an ownmost being, something like that. And so Nietzsche writes, quote, what all life exhibits to be observed as a reduced formula for the universal tendency, a new grip on the concept life as will to power, end quote. So the new grip on the concept is that all life repeats this tendency of the whole for self-overcoming, remaking, reinventing, and yes, error and deception, recasting the world in its own image in accord with its volition. And the important thing for Heidegger is that is the universal tendency. So again, I can see a Nietzschean taking issue with much in Heidegger, but what we could say that he's doing is looking to this note as being of central importance. He's trying to square that circle of saying the universal truth for Nietzsche is perspective. And it's becoming, but becoming is in the same way that like you have the being itself with a capital B and then the being of beings. You have like becoming itself as like a concept, and then you have the becoming of beings, right? Which is according to your own perspective, what you're able to become is part of the thrownness of your being. And so oftentimes people will raise these kinds of arguments against relativistic views of the world, such as perspectivism, and say, is that a universal truth? And Heidegger would say, yes, perspectivism is the universal tendency. Or to state it maybe in a different way, will to power is the universal tendency. That each being has its perspective, its short-sightedness, its quote-unquote error and self-deception, the fact that it's not starting from a neutral place. That's from the standpoint of the whole, from the standpoint of a God, from the God's eye view. It's an error and self-deception because no one of these perspectives takes in the whole. And yet we can make a universal statement about all beings that they all do this. And that's in fact what makes knowledge possible as they take, through their own volition, their errors that are the most valuable to their way of life and eternalize them. And therefore stamp their becoming with a form of being. That form of thought, which again, thought and will, thinking and willing are interrelated, is the highest operation of the will to power. And so the fact that we're willing beings who create knowledge as an invention, that's part of the ultimate expression of will to power. Heidegger explains it this way, and he quotes Nietzsche multiple times within this passage. Quote, "To the question, what is truth?" Nietzsche answers, quote, "Truth is the kind of error without which a certain kind of being could not live. The value for life ultimately decides." End quote. Quote, "Truth, this, according to my way of thinking, does not necessarily denote the antithesis of error, but in the most fundamental cases, only the position of various errors in relation to one another." End quote. It would, of course, be utterly superficial to explain such statements in the following way. Nietzsche takes everything that is an error to be true. Nietzsche's statement, "Truth is error, error truth," can be grasped only in terms of his fundamental position in opposition to all Western philosophy since Plato. End quote. And this is why the rest of the note, recapitulation, concerns the need for the revaluation. Why? Because the inefficacy of the old ideas, of the Platonic way of thinking about truth, which then becomes Christianity. See, even Platonism has to overcome itself and produce an artful error, an artful invention in order to make its truth possible. Because so long as Platonism remained merely a philosophy of the intelligible world, it didn't have the power that it had when it took on these supernatural claims. It could only be the perspective of a few rare philosophical types, not the great masses of humanity. So even Platonism had to overcome itself. But Platonism, as this way of viewing being as static, persistent, and behind the world, becomes Christianity. And so the interesting thing about Heidegger's interpretation here is that Nietzsche sees the error in every thought. Its error, quote unquote, in a way, is Platonism itself, right? Is the eternalizing, the perdurance, the idea of persistence. And so, in a way, every philosophy, every thought as an expression of will to power ends up capitulating to this error of Platonism insofar as it eternalizes anything, insofar as it posits anything as persistent. In that way, it partakes of error. But it's precisely his own highest thought of becoming being the true character of being, his own peak of the meditation, that dispenses with Platonism, that sees perspective as the eternal truth, right? Which then it turns Platonism on its head. And that's necessary because Platonism, we could see the aphorism of the madman, the death of God. The Platonism is facing its annihilation. And with the annihilation of these ideals, we face nihilism, a crisis of the psyche. That is to say, the God, that way of viewing the world through that sort of Platonic error, was at least motivating, but we're sacrificing the one thing in the belief that was actually motivating about it. That is the real significance of the death of God. And so there's a need to come in and give us a new concept, which is universal and yet not Platonist. How can we achieve this? By the universalization of perspective. So Nietzsche's will to power is not another shadow of God, like, say, causality, cause and effect. That's simply another representation of natural law. At one time, a God's will ruling over existence, and then eventually it becomes a formula that apprehends over existence. Instead, Nietzsche says, we're not going to find one formula for existence, but the formulae of existence, and the wills, plural, of these individual beings. And importantly, they're short-sighted wills. And finally, we must comprehend that Plato's own scheme for eternalizing being was itself a short-sighted will. And there's something very subversive even in that exposure, that disclosure that Nietzsche makes to us. And so Heidegger argues, quote, "It is a basic experience gained from the history of valuations that even the positing of the uppermost values does not take place at a single stroke, that eternal truth never blazes in the heavens overnight, that no people in history has had its truth fall into its lap. Those who posit the uppermost values, the creators, the new philosophers at the forefront, must, according to Nietzsche, be experimenters. They must tread paths and break trails in the knowledge that they do not have the truth. But from such knowledge, it does not at all follow that they have to view their concepts as mere betting chips that can be exchanged at any time for any currency. What does follow is just the opposite. Solidity and binding quality of thought must undergo a grounding in the things themselves in a way that prior philosophy does not know. Only in this way is it possible for a basic position to assert itself over against others, so that the resultant strife will be actual strife, and thus the actual origin of truth." End quote. So that's the unity of the revaluation with the will to power and the eternal recurrence. Stamping the character of becoming, or will to power, stamping that onto the world means reversing Platonism, which both reveals the way in which the Platonic values, the Christian values, have devalued themselves and led to nihilism, and it proposes truth as emergent from strife, that is to say, from new attempts, new perspectives based on new groundings, to include perspective as a condition of life and knowledge. To say it another way, will to power always necessitates a revaluation, because will to power necessitates overcoming, which means overcoming the old perspective. It's an inevitability. And so, of course, Nietzsche wraps himself up in his own philosophical critique in that his own will to power doctrine is not derived from a vacuum. Nietzsche is also engaged in thinking as a kind of reinvention. Will to power as a doctrine is Nietzsche's act of volition, and thus it's his will to power. It comes from somewhere. It comes from Nietzsche's perspective. And just as Heidegger says, he's on a quest to destroy the previous traditions of metaphysics so we can begin anew, Nietzsche's doing the same thing, destroying the Platonic tradition of metaphysics to show how Platonic being comes from that same kind of perspectival activity. And so to relate this back to the unity of will to power and eternal recurrence, Heidegger summarizes it this way, quote, when he thinks, quote, the most difficult thought at the peak of the meditation, Nietzsche thinks and meditates on being, that is, on will to power as eternal recurrence. What does that mean? Taken quite broadly and essentially. Eternity not as a static now, nor as a series of nows rolling off into the infinite, but as the now that bends back into itself. What is that if not the concealed essence of time? Thinking being, will to power, as eternal return, thinking the most difficult thought of philosophy, means thinking being as time. Nietzsche thinks that thought, but does not think it as the question of being and time. Plato and Aristotle also think that thought when they conceive being as ousia, presence, but just as little as Nietzsche do they think it as a question. If we do ask the question, we do not mean to suggest that we are cleverer than both Nietzsche and Western philosophy, which Nietzsche only thinks to its end. We know that the most difficult thought of philosophy has only become more difficult, that the peak of the meditation has not yet been conquered, and perhaps not yet even discovered at all. End quote. Again, to us Nietzscheans who know that philosophy is the confession of its author, there's something funny here that Heidegger looks into Nietzsche's philosophy and he finds that Nietzsche thinks of being as time. That's the most important thing in Nietzsche's work. And thus Nietzsche ends the project of Western philosophy and opens up the question of being and time. So one could say Heidegger investigates Nietzsche and finds a proto-Heidegger. Very suspicious. Now, in Heidegger's defense, he does go on to say in the preceding paragraphs that he's not saying Nietzsche's work is the same as the content in his own book, Being and Time. But, the interpretation he draws is at least suspicious, isn't it? He's not saying he's cleverer than Nietzsche, as he says. The peak of the meditation has perhaps not even been discovered yet. But, that's maybe the saving grace of this, is that he's saying, look, I'm not saying Nietzsche just set everything up for my work. I'm saying in a way that maybe the task that Nietzsche laid out is also my task, and it's as yet unfinished. And yet again, we have this emphasis on making everything more difficult, which not trying to rush to the ending that I think comes through here as well. So in other words, we should of course read Heidegger critically, but we can at least acknowledge that insofar as the statements Nietzsche makes in his notes, there is something here. And I want to zero in on one claim Heidegger makes about the eternal return, quote, eternity not as a static now, nor as a series of nows rolling off into the infinite, but the now that bends back into itself, end quote. I think this is key for understanding the way that Heidegger thinks about time, about temporality, and the real esoteric meaning of eternal return, which I think is part and parcel with that stamp of being that Heidegger is so keen about. Every instance of becoming, every event, every force, every transformation, every aspect of the flux called existence becomes both fleeting and not, in itself eternal, right? Eternal in the sense that it repeats again and again. From within becoming, from our short-sighted standpoint, changes the rule, but if eternal return is the structure of time, then eternality is the rule, and the now bends back into itself. The now is real in the sense that perhaps Parmenides was looking for, in that what is real is what is, not what used to be or what will be. And Nietzsche would say, well, the now always is. And the reason why I say this is key to the understanding of temporality is because we don't experience, quote unquote, time itself in the sense of like chronos, infinite time, right? Remember in the Greek myth when Zeus overthrows Chronos, he ends infinite time and Zeus begins the dominion of measured time. And that's what we do in Heidegger's view. We measure time, we take possession of it as a resource, as something we have. We live in the future, we constantly project into the future, we divide up time in the future, we're constantly measuring the time that we have. Effectively, we live in the future. But that future is always imagined and it always refers back to the now, which we're always in. In the past, we also calculate from the now. And in actuality for us, for Dasein, those nows don't roll off into infinity. What I mean by that is there's a set point of beginning and termination. That the idea of nows rolling off into infinity, that chronos time is sort of like an empty concept. That we always calculate the future and the past from the moment of now, and we can only calculate a finite amount of time, right? Obviously, because the idea of a human being calculating infinitely is not possible. You don't have enough time to calculate an infinite amount of time. You have to arbitrarily stop at some point or another, right? So the now is always the center out of which you're looking forward and looking back, and you can proceed a certain amount of calculable or measured time in either direction, but at a certain point, you have to stop arbitrarily at one point or another. So eternity, as a static now, would be just another capitulation to Platonism. The Nietzschean structure of time through eternal return instead centers us on a moving now that centers you on the subjective experience of now, and it centers every perspective on your own now as eternal, as being, as the center point of past and future, which is conceived of in relation to the present. And so far from just being a Heideggerian innovation, I think this view of being as time is absolutely there in Nietzsche, at least it's arguably there. Supposing that eternal return does stamp becoming with the character of being, insofar as eternal return is supposed to eternalize the own most perspectival now of the subject, something like that. And so we get this wonderful comparison that Heidegger makes, and here I'm jumping ahead to one of actually the last sections of Book 2 of his lecture notes, where Heidegger argues that the question of being has been answered two archetypal ways by the pre-Socratics. Quote, "The one answer, roughly speaking, is the answer of Parmenides. It tells us that being is. An odd sort of answer, no doubt, yet a very deep one, since that very response determines for the first time and for all thinkers to come, including Nietzsche, the meaning of is and being, permanence and presence, that is, the eternal present. The other answer, roughly speaking, that of Heraclitus, tells us that being becomes. The being is in being by virtue of its permanent becoming, its self-unfolding and eventual dissolution." End quote. So that's the dichotomy, yet again, the supposed paradox between becoming and being, and the two ways that being as becoming, and becoming as being, kind of try to subsume one another. And yet Heidegger sees Nietzsche as synthesizing the two with his twin doctrines and producing this beautiful unraveling of the knot. And I love the way Heidegger puts this. Quote, "Nietzsche argues that being is as fixated as permanent, and that it is in perpetual creation and destruction. Yet being is both of these, not in an extrinsic way as one beside the other, rather being is in its very ground perpetual creation, becoming. While as creation it needs what is fixed. Creation needs what is fixed first in order to overcome it, and second in order to have something that has yet to be fixated, something that enables the creative to advance beyond itself and be transfigured. The essence of being is becoming, but what becomes is and has being only in creative transfiguration. What is and what becomes are fused in the fundamental thought that what becomes is, inasmuch as in creation it becomes being and is becoming." End quote. And further down, Heidegger continues, quote, "Nietzsche once wrote, at the time when the thought of return first loomed on his horizon during the years 1881-82, quote, 'Let us imprint the emblem of eternity on our life,' end quote. The phrase means, let us introduce an eternalization to ourselves as beings. and hence to beings as a whole, let us introduce the transfiguration of what becomes as something that becomes being. And let us do this in such a way that the eternalization arises from being itself, originating for being, standing in being. The sense is not that one must brush aside and replace becoming as the impermanent, for impermanence is what becoming implies, with being as the permanent. The sense is that one must shape becoming as being in such a way that as becoming it is preserved, as subsistence, in a word is. Such stamping, that is the recoining of becoming as being, is the supreme will to power. In such recoining, the will to power comes to prevail most purely in its essence." End quote. And so, for Heidegger, the will to power attains its highest form, frankly, in metaphysics, but as a way of, again, thinking is willing, willing is thinking, and in seeing becoming as being, we might see that fundamental thought of the will and the ability that for creativity and transformation that provides us with by giving us something fixed so that the fixed can be overcome, and meanwhile counterposing being permanence, persistence with change as another permanent aspect. Again, not counterposed, not extrinsic, but unified in the grounding being and becoming. And so the power of this vision of the world as will to power is found precisely in that word that we use so often and yet do not contemplate. The word which is so close to us and yet so far from us. The world is will to power. Is. That is the being of the world, will to power. We don't make that claim in order to make the world fixed, but to show how the world is not fixed. We don't brush aside becoming in favor of permanence. We say the permanent thing, the one principle you're looking for, points toward impermanence. We say all things change and become, and what they want to become is being. But just in the act of saying, this is that, we're making a statement about being, and that's the operating principle of Heidegger that we have to understand and carry forward in order to make sense of his reading of Nietzsche as a metaphysician. All right, well, we've gone on for quite a while, and I feel as though I've barely scratched the surface, but that's just fine. This is only part 1, and unlike Heidegger, I'm going to complete this episode. I don't intend to leave my work perpetually unfinished. I did think about how funny that would be to leave it unfinished, but I'm too kind to do that. So, in any case, I'm not going to cover every last thing in Heidegger's lectures on Nietzsche. I felt that his material on his material strictly on eternal return and on nihilism, a lot of that we've mostly covered already. Although Heidegger, he gives some interesting remarks. I'll occasionally draw from those sections where it's helpful. By far, Heidegger's most interesting work on Nietzsche is where he really gets into the depths of will to power from 2 different perspectives. First as art, and second as knowledge and metaphysics. So we're going to do an episode on each one. Join me next week for Heidegger's lectures on the will to power as art. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.